Hey guys, we're going to go ahead and get started in a moment. Okay. All right, guys. Sorry about that. I'm going solo tonight, so I'm trying to manage several windows here, and I only have two monitors to do it. Can you guys hear me, first of all? If you guys can hear me, can one of you guys respond on the YouTube live chat just to let me know if you guys can hear me? Cool, perfect. All right, good. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead. Looks like there's not that many of us in here, which is cool because it means you guys are going to get all of the time. So we can start off by, let me do this. Let me, oh, an echo. Okay, let me see. What could be causing the echo? Let me think. um, hmm, not really sure what would be causing the echo. We have one window open with audio. Okay, so only Golden Heaven can hear an echo. Is that right? Yeah, I don't see. Okay, then it should be good. Not sure what would cause the distortion, so sorry about that. Um, oh. Okay. Well, at least we got that solved. All right, so cool. So let's go ahead and get started. Since we don't have like a ton of people, I'm seeing only 7 viewers, so there'll be more time to answer your questions. So I just want to go over kind of this week's topic. Uh, you guys should have, let me actually share my screen here. Okay, you guys should be able to see my screen. And you guys should have gone over the Advanced Lighting Principles, Part 1, which is the part that talks about photons, light photons, and global illumination, that sort of thing. Um, can someone confirm that that's what you guys went over? Not sure if you guys heard me. Um, just want to see if you guys were able to go over global illumination. Cool. Okay, so just really quick, global illumination is like a really big topic. Um, but you guys saw the video. So it's a pretty cool way of seeing your lighting. So let's have a look at the homework and do some critique on that. Can bring this over. Cool. So is this all the homework? Three. I'm just seeing three submissions, and one of them's actually from a previous week, but we can have a look at that too. So if anybody else has anything that they want me to critique and stuff, feel free to just post it up on the Discord channel, and we can go over that. So let's have a look at the first one here. Apologies for that. I've got some pretty bad allergies. It's the one thing that stinks about living in Austin, Texas. It's the allergy capital of the country. Cool. So let's have a look at this. So this has global illumination in it. You're getting the color bleed from the blue wall over here and on the back of the cylinder. Also getting a lot of color bleed from the green. The green happens to just color bleed a little bit more. Got an area light up here. Got some noise. I know that rendering can be pretty slow, but you want to make sure that you increase the sampling on your area light and your anti-aliasing to get rid of a lot of this sort of artifacting stuff that you're getting from the area light. Um, Other than that, this pretty much demonstrates what we talked about, right? Turning on global illumination and having your GI, your photons and stuff do all of the indirect lighting, which you can see here. So that's pretty good. What I would say is for this piece, I would go ahead and explore, just explore trying to get a little bit more gradient of light. Right now, the lighting's a little bit flat, which is fine for like a little test scene, like one of these Cornell boxes. But based on what you've learned, I would try to use global, try to build like a little a simple scene. Maybe if like maybe this is like a box, but like the ceiling's gone and you've got a sky in the background, and try to get some of that indirect lighting from the sky coming in through here. Just get something a little bit more interesting. And it's not about the lighting being good or bad. It's more about practice and just expanding your knowledge based on what you've done. So other than that, I really don't have much else for this one. This is week 3, but we'll go ahead and do this one anyway. So on this one, um, it almost looks like there's a shadow or something covering a large portion of the image. If you look at the background image, you can see that it's really sunny. There's a good amount of exposure, so I would expect um, the vehicle here, the Lamborghini, to also have a good amount of lighting on it. So it looks a little bit overcast, and that's not a bad thing if you're going for an overcast look. but it just kind of looks weird, almost like think about like if this car was driving on a street and it's a sunny day, but there's really tall buildings. Maybe it's driving around downtown somewhere, and there's really tall buildings that are occluding the light and just casting shadowing all over this area. That's kind of what it feels like to me. I'm not sure if the author was going for that because that wouldn't be a bad thing. But if that was the case, you would probably see some more pronounced shadows from the buildings, and you'd probably want to get some buildings in the background. Not that that's part of the homework assignment, but I'm just saying if you're trying to go for an overcast look, you might as well just kind of commit to it and really hammer that home. In this case, though, I'm not getting that. It just feels like the render has is just very underexposed and probably should have more just stronger lighting so that it feels like it's really outside and the sun and the sky are hitting it. Because again, it feels like the car is in shadow right now. Getting good shadowing underneath the car, some occlusion down there, which is pretty good. In terms of the reflections, look fine. I don't see anything that's glaring about that right now. Uh, Obviously, want to work a little bit on the materials, but that's outside of the scope of this course. Even though lighting materials go hand in hand, this is a beginner lighting course, so we're not too worried about materials yet. That'll come in a later course where we'll see how lighting materials kind of get married to each other and play off of each other's strengths and weaknesses. I do like that you can kind of see them here inside the car. There is some indirect lighting in here, which is pretty cool. I like that. Of course, you could do tinted windows on the car so you can't see that, but I actually like that the author actually allowed the inside to be visible from the outside and got some lighting and stuff in there too, and still got some reflections, which is pretty good. Again, the only thing I really do on this is kind of decide what your lighting setup is going to be. If you're going for overcast and dark and shadowy, then reflect that upon the background too, because again, the background looks like it's a bright day, a bright afternoon, or maybe almost midday, maybe like at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that, 1400 hours. So you probably want to reflect that onto the car as well. So you want the car to feel like it's being lit by that kind of a sun and sky. So that would be pretty much my feedback for this one. Not going to give any feedback on the model or the materials itself because that goes outside of the scope of the course. For the ground, I'm personally not a big fan of uniformly reflective grounds, but again, this isn't a material course, so we're not too worried about that. But if you could, I would experiment if you wanted to expand upon this scene a little bit more. I would go ahead and experiment with doing a glossy floor, which would be pretty cool. And you know what? We're going to be covering that in week 5. So I would grab this scene again after you go through week 5 and apply some of the glossy, reflective course material that we're going to be covering in week 5. So we haven't gotten there yet, but when we do, I would give this another pass. So here's another one. I actually really like this one. The author took their time to create something a little bit more interesting. I do like the indentations in the wall and the fact that those edges are beveled is pretty cool. And again, this isn't a modeling course, so we're not too worried about that. I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I didn't do that, so did I do it wrong? No, you didn't do it wrong. But it's always cool to see people kind of think outside the box, no pun intended, and kind of go above and beyond, do some extra stuff. Again, it doesn't mean that you're wrong if you didn't do that, not at all. But it is always cool to see this kind of stuff because it helps play around with lighting a little bit differently. Um, so that's always pretty cool. I do like the materials on the wall, on the sides and stuff. And I know that this isn't a materials course, and we're not really concerned too much with materials, just super bare basics that allow us to light our scene. But this is pretty cool, getting these very glossy walls that look almost like they're plastic or something. Look kind of cool. It just feels pretty neat. and it works with the lighting pretty well. And I also find it pretty interesting that the ceiling and the floor were purposely made very, very reflective, so not glossy, but very mirror-like. I think that's pretty interesting. Add some reflections and stuff, and by not doing that to the sides, it doesn't make the it doesn't make the image too noisy where there's reflections all over the place, and then you look like you're in a fun house looking at a hall of mirrors or something. So pretty good call there. Good job with that stuff. I also think it's pretty cool that the sphere is black and very has a mirror polish to it. That's pretty neat. I also like the beveled cube is a nice touch. Beveling is always good in CG just because you can get much nicer lighting, um, creating much better forms and stuff. In real life, you really don't have hard edge objects. It's pretty rare. Knife edge objects usually only exist, say, if you break a piece of glass and have a sharp edge on a piece of glass, or if you have an actual kitchen knife, which of course has a knife edge to it, or an edge of paper. Those sorts of things have very tight edges. So it's always good to see beveling on edges. But again, this isn't a modeling course, so we're not going to get into that too much. Sorry about that. The area lighting is pretty good. There's a good amount of sampling here, so you don't see a lot of artifacts. In terms of what we can do to improve this, not a big fan of the way that underneath the black sphere looks right here. The reflection just looks kind of funny on the floor. And I know it gets dark over here, but might want to work on getting a little bit more contrast. It's kind of distracted. Like when I look at this scene, the first thing I want to look at is this area up here. But then for my eyes tend to kind of navigate down here to this really weird reflection back here. So you might want to add maybe, what you did with the walls is pretty good because you made it very rough and glossy. So your eyes don't get stuck on the walls. They stay where they're supposed to stay. But because the floor is highly reflective and it's dark, you end up, your eye just kind of gets stuck down here and doesn't want to move from this spot. So you want to be kind of mindful of that. So to fix that, what I would do is I would make the floor glossy. Excuse me. And I like what you did with the glossy walls and stuff. So what you might want to do is kind of find a happy medium where you make the floor glossy, but not as glossy as the walls, just a bit to break up this reflection and not make your eye get drawn to it completely, but still have some reflection down here so it looks different from the walls, which would do what you were trying to achieve, but probably do it in a more natural way that doesn't make the viewer focus down here. In terms of your color bleeding, looks pretty good to me. But because the image is a little bit dark, you really don't see the color bleeding on the ceiling. Um, I don't think using green on the ceiling was a bad idea, but if you used white or maybe a green that had a higher value, you'll see a little bit more color bleeding on the ceiling, which isn't necessarily like a good or bad thing, but it's good for practice to see how the color bleeding bounces off of things. Um, I like the value of the floor, but I would also experiment with increasing the value of the floor again to promote more color bleeding in your scene. But other than that stuff, good job. This looks really good. um, so let's have a look at this one. So this is pretty cool. It's a bright image, but it doesn't feel like really overexposed. I like the walls. It's almost more like a Lambertian shading model. Not a big fan of completely Lambertian shading models, just because when something gets really bright on it, if it has color, like this red wall, it starts to look a little bit fake. You wouldn't really see this very often in the real world. Sorry about that. So be careful about that, about taking very saturated colors and just kind of overexposing things. White usually works pretty well. You can see at the sphere, it looks really natural. Has a really nice photographic look to it, which is pretty cool. And the whitewash on the top contrasts pretty well with the dark occlusion and contact shadows on the bottom. So that stuff looks pretty cool. Like we did with the light too. It looks like the light is almost bubbling down like a piece of geo, so that's pretty neat. Um, I do like that the way that the color bleeding is mixing the shadowed areas. So like the blue, for example, and the red, you can see that they're both contributing to the shadows here, which looks very natural and is in fact the way that light behaves in the real world, which is pretty cool. You can really see an example of that behind a cube. So that's pretty cool. That looks really nice. This image has a pretty nice soft feel to it. And there's a really nice, interesting kind of noisy object here. I can't really tell what it is because I can't really zoom in past this. Um, it almost looks like some kind of translucent toy car or something. I really don't know. But it looks pretty cool. It's a nice detailed object, and the illumination on it looks pretty detailed, which means that the um, the sampling and the accuracy of the global illumination is pretty high and pretty well to capture those kinds of details, which is pretty good. It's the kind of stuff that you see in film. So good job. The only thing I would kind of work on this is, again, going with really overexposed but highly saturated colors for walls. Might want to be careful about that and not kind of overdo it. The blue wall doesn't look too bad. Um, but the red wall definitely looks a little bit fake and just really strange. So to fix that, because I get that same problem too when I'm doing lighting for either CG or games, what I'll do is I'll desaturate this a little bit. So if you take this red wall and you desaturate it a little bit and do test renders until you get something that looks red but doesn't look like it's glowing like this in this sort of unrealistic way, you'll get something a little bit more interesting. Like the blue wall over here is pretty saturated. You can see the highlight where the light is hitting it still feels natural and realistic, and it doesn't look like totally fake like the red one. The red one's just not working very well. So I would just desaturate that a bit and see what you get. Cool. Here's another one from week 3. Let's have a look at this one. So this one's pretty cool. This one pretty much nails it on the head with HDRI rendering. You got your HDR image in the background. The image doesn't look like it's the best, and I'll tell you why. I can see that there's an issue with the way it's lighting. The reflections look fine, and reflections will usually look pretty good with HDR renders. But one of the problems that you'll find is that you don't get a lot of directionality to the light. And there's a couple of reasons to that. Not all HDR images are built the same. There are well taken HDR photographs and poorly taken HDR photographs out there. They're not all the best quality. They may be, 32-bit EXRs, but that doesn't mean that the exposure and the camera that was used and when it was photographed that it was taken the best way. So with this image, I don't see any directionality to the light besides the sun in the reflections. One of the other reasons that could cause that is the fact that everything in the scene is reflective, with the exception of the background image of the HDR. So what you might want to try is putting a matte shader on the floor. That way you don't get like just pure reflections all over the place, which is never overly interesting. So I would put like a very matte finished shader on the ground. Um, if you look at like the white wall of the building in the background, maybe create a material that looks like that. Maybe not as high in value, but definitely not super reflective. And let me see. I'm going to I'm just jump on Google real quick. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about with the directionality in the images. Let me find. Find an image and show you. Oh man, I can't seem to find it. I was going to hdrskies.com, but looks like they changed the way that they preview. Well, that kind of stinks. I was going to show you guys an image on hdriskies.com. Just my personal opinion here, I'll show you guys real quick. If you go to hdri-skies.com, you have some pretty good HDRIs. I've actually tested these and used these in professional commercial settings myself, and they are some of the better HDRI images out there. If you render out with these guys, you get really good directionality with your HDRs. So these guys do a really good job in my experience from what I've seen and used. These guys do a really good job of capturing lots of lighting information in their HDRs. And I know that obviously they have prices and stuff, but they also have free HDRs. So like if you get their 4K HDRs, which is actually pretty large, they're free. If you want, you can pay like €8 and get 15K HDR. Oh, here we go. Here's some test renders. So let me show you this one. This is a great example. So if you look at this test render, the HDR is in the background, just like here, right? Same thing. But you'll notice that in this image, everything kind of looks flat except for the reflections. And by flat, I mean there's no directionality to the light. If we go back and I show you that, where'd it go? Over here. If you look at this image, what you'll see is that there's directionality to the light. Of course, this isn't just, a reflective sphere in the middle of the scene. There's an entire building. But if you look at the building, look at the right angles of the building, you'll see that it almost appears that there's a sun coming from a direction, right? From behind us to the left. It looks like there's a sunset, right? And if we look at the image in this HDR, there's a very strong sun direction you can see on the white building in the background, right? There's a very strong sun direction, but we don't see it in the actual render. We should see what appears to be almost like a directional or sunlight hitting from the side. And we don't see that. We can see it in the reflections, and we can see it hitting the background image, but we don't see it in the CG elements that have been rendered out. And the reason for that is because, again, not all HDR images are the same. There's high quality ones like these, and then there's poor quality ones, which you can find them all over the internet. So you want to be careful when you get HDR images from the internet that they're pretty good. Again, I recommend these guys, HDR Skies. These guys do a very good job of capturing a good amount of stops of exposure in their HDRs. We won't go over like HDR photography right now. Maybe we can do that like in a future course. But that stuff is a skill in itself. So if you're seeing that your renders have very flat global illumination when you're using an HDR, it's probably because your HDR image doesn't have good a range. So you can see in this image, this HDR has great range. And again, I've used these before, and I can personally attest that they have great range. You can see in this image especially, see the shadowed area on the side, but then this side of the wall has a very strong directional light. Again, you can see it here. See this top L-shaped wall piece up here is reflecting most of the sky color. But then when you look at this strip of wall right here, you can see that there's a directionality of the sun hitting it. So anyway, I think that makes sense, right? So I'd probably want to work on that. Other than that, this looks pretty good. So here's another one. Sorry about that. Again, same. It almost looks like this is the same HDR image actually from the other one. Is it? Hang on a second. Yeah, I think this is the same HDR being used in both of these. Ah, it is. Okay. Well, same issue. Um, this one feels a little bit dull, like the gamma's turned up maybe a little bit too high, so it starts to get kind of milky and washed out. The contrast, for example, looks much better in this one, and it kind of matches with the background image a little bit better. But this starts to get kind of milky and washed out, which is never what you want. So you always have to kind of tweak your gamma and stuff. Other than that, it looks pretty much the same as the other one in terms of the HDR image having little to no directionality. So be real careful about that. And oh yeah, cool. This was a car. Looks awesome. Oh, and you've got the caustics and everything. That's really neat. Yeah, you should have posted this before. That looks pretty cool. This translucent car. Great idea using this with blurred refraction, blurred translucency to get the you got the caustics and everything. That looks pretty cool. Great job. This is really good. Um, yeah, yeah. I see Golden Heaven saying it's his first attempt or her first attempt. Um, but no, I mean it looks pretty good. It's not a bad start. It's really about getting a good HDR image. And here's a trick for you if you, for whatever reason, you can't get a better HDR image. Although I showed you that website where you can get them for free, so um, I would jump on that and start making like a little library of them. Just start downloading all their free ones and testing out different ones. But if you find yourself in a situation like this, which I've actually found myself in the past, if you don't have a better HDR, and again, I've been in that situation myself, a trick is to actually throw in the sunlight. So what you can do in a situation like this, if you have to use this HDR image, you can actually throw in a directional light. If this was, let's say it was done in Maya or something, I don't know what program it was done in, but if it was done in something like Maya, you can throw in a directional light too, and just set the orientation so it matches with the light in the HDR image, so it's coming from the same direction, right? That way it doesn't look like you have two suns. And once you do that, you can play with the intensity of the sun and try to make it match. And then you can pretty much give your object directionality. And a good way of doing that is just looking at the HDR image itself. So you can see it and you can get a good idea what the azimuth of the sun is and try to match it with your directional sun. Just rotate it until it looks like the sun in your CG scene matches up with the direction and the orientation of the sun in the background plate on your HDR image, and then that'll give you the directionality that you're missing in the image. So it's a two-pronged approach where you use a combination of the HDR image to get the really nice reflections because this HDR image is giving you great reflections. The only problem is the directionality of the light. So adding directional light and combining those things um, will help to give you that directionality and make the image um, not only match with the background a lot better, but also make it more interesting. um, cool. Um, oh, cool. That is an old blog post on CG Circuit. Somebody found a old blog post over here from CG Circuit. I can't remember when I did this blog post. 2004. Cool. Yeah. Does anybody else have any more homework or anything they want to get critiqued? If not, then we can do some questions and stuff. Mhm. Somebody asked, what is caustics? So I'm actually glad that I've got my PowerPoint slide up because we can go over to the caustics. So I covered this in in the most recent weekly lesson. So you can go in there and see caustics, and I actually show a demonstration using Maya and Mental Ray on how to activate caustics. Most most offline renderers support caustics in some form of another, like renderers like Arnold and Mental Ray, V-Ray, Pixar's RenderMan, et cetera, et cetera. So whichever renderer you want to use is perfectly fine, as long as you can, do caustics with it. And caustics is simply put, it's an effect that happens when light gets refracted through a translucent object. It basically gets bent and its direction gets changed, and what you end up seeing, with your human eye is these really cool kind of patterns and effects. You usually see this with things like water or glass and things like that. Um, and we actually got a really cool example of that from one of our students. This was Dane. Dane did a little close up here where you could see some caustics going on down here, going through this translucent little card. It looks like it's got like machine guns and stuff on top. Pretty cool. Looks like something out of Halo, actually. Almost like a little sportier version of a warthog. So let me see. We've got some questions here. You've worked in different studios using different game engines. You're teaching us in Unreal. So how's the usual learning curve when you shift engines, and how soon are artists expected to excel in them? Let me make sure I didn't miss a question up top, actually. Cool. So good question. So the question is basically, hey, if you use a lot of game engines in, either the same or different studios, what's the learning curve when you have to shift, and how are you expected, right, to learn that? That's a really good question. Um, Learning curve can be pretty steep. The basics still apply, and that's the whole point of me going through this 101 course. Originally, what I was going to do, and I could probably show you guys, hang on one second. Do I have that out? Let me see. Hang on one second. Okay, here we go. So this is the Introduction to Lighting Theory and Principles. This is the course that you guys are in right now, which is 5 weeks and goes over the basics, right? So things like physics of light and how light decays, photons, global illumination, shadow maps, ray trace shadows, area lights, point lights, directional lights, spotlights, geometry lights, caustics, photons, global illumination, ambient occlusion, whole bunch of stuff. These are all basics of lighting. These are basics that you can take with you pretty much anywhere you go. So if you're going to be working in something like Mental Ray, you can use these basic fundamentals once you understand them to go ahead and start lighting scenes and things, right? If you're going to go to Unreal Engine 4, you can use these basic and fundamentals and you can apply them there with light mass and even with dynamic lighting. If you're going to go to another offline renderer like Maxwell or V-Ray or RenderMan or Arnold, you can apply these basic principles there. So they're basic fundamentals and understanding of light and how light works in computer graphics. And you can use that anywhere. So as long as you know that stuff, that's going to help you out. If you don't know that stuff, then the learning curve is going to be pretty steep and pretty tough when you're talking about working on commercial projects and things. Personally, I'm very technically oriented, and I've been doing this for a while. So for me personally, it's not impossible. There is a learning curve. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it's easy. I just jump from one engine to the other, no problem. It's not that easy. There is work you have to do. There's research you have to do, but you also have to have an understanding of fundamentals, right? Because I'll give you an example. Working with the Call of Duty engine, it has global illumination. And it works very similar to Unreal Engine 4's global illumination through light mass. So once you understand how global illumination and photon mapping works, all you really need to know is figure out, say if you were going from Unreal to the Call of Duty engine for the first time, you would basically just need to know where the switches and buttons and levers and the tools are for doing global illumination and how to control global illumination in the COD engine. Once you figure that out, you already know what photon mapping and global illumination is and how it works. So at that point, you can start using it. A very simple, dumbed down example would be if you're used to driving a sports car, and then suddenly now you're going to drive, I don't know, a truck, right? They're kind of different. The arrangement's pretty different. The way that they work is kind of different, but the basic fundamentals are the same. They're both going to have a gas pedal. They're both going to have brakes. Both going to have headlights. They're both going to have, driver seats and stuff. So it's not impossible to move from one to the other if you know the fundamentals. So, and as to part of the question as to how you're expected to excel in them, well, game studios are paying you a pretty good salary to do this stuff, so you are kind of expected to be a professional. And if you need to learn and get ramped up on something like a new engine or something, there is flexibility. You're not expected to suddenly turn on your computer and know how to do it. No one can do that, no matter how good or experienced you are. But you are expected to learn it pretty quickly. So you know, say you're using the engine for the first time, you might be expected to be up and running, doing lighting and stuff in maybe a couple of weeks or something. You can't take 6 months to learn it. You're gonna have to learn it in a couple of weeks. So that's kind of a rough ballpark, but there's a lot of factors that come into play, like milestones, deadlines, the studio itself, the projects, that sort of thing. Can I use HDR that is purely a sky? I want to make a realistic water reflection in UE4. Yeah, you can totally do that. HDRs don't have to have buildings in the background and stuff like that. Sky is fine. As a matter of fact, when I do professional work and I also create skyboxes and HDR skyboxes in Photoshop, Photoshop is pretty decent at handling 32-bit EXRs. But Nuke is also a favorite when having to edit 32-bit HDR images and comp stuff together. But yeah, it's perfectly fine to use a pure sky. I actually do that pretty often. I'll do a sky in Unreal 4 that just has the sky with some clouds and that sort of thing, whatever I want in them. And buildings and things like that, I'll usually actually create geo, like distant vista geo and cards and stuff, and use that in the vista. Next question: when does a lighting artist begin his work? After a scene is totally completed by the environment artist, or when they even started on blockout phase? That's a really good question. Um, uh, it really depends on the studio and the pipeline, um, and it also depends on the project. Some projects, depending on the project, you may already have a library of assets to use. And in that case, you can have scenes blocked out and meshed out pretty quick, so you can get started in lighting pretty quickly. Some projects may be starting completely from scratch, and there is no library of assets, and you have to work with map lead and world builders. And sometimes as a lighter, you'll be bottlenecked, which means you kind of can't really do your production work until a certain amount of art has been completed by environment artists and world builders. So it's really a case by case basis thing. I've been in both situations where the levels were ready to go, and I was ready to just rock and roll and get in there and start doing lighting and stuff. I've been in situations where it was the complete opposite, and art had not been done, and the only thing that's been done is gray box design layout levels. So it really depends on the project that comes along and the studio really. That's kind of the answer to that question. Me personally, ideally, of course, if I could, I would love to have levels already arted out so that I can just start doing lighting. Um, but one thing that commonly happens is levels, as they get arted up, materials get added and materials do change. Sometimes the art director or map lead may want to change, may not be happy with the value or the hues of certain materials that are being used in, say, a room or a courtyard or something like that. And if that changes, your lighting rig has to change too, because now your materials completely changed, and that affects the way that light um, bounces off and reflects off of those things. So you're going to have to update your lighting. Um, are we missing out much on those subjects not talked along the classes? Not sure which subjects you're referring to. Um, each week certain subject is covered, so those subjects are talked about. So not really sure what you mean with that question. Next question. I hear environment artists like to change things in their environment to the game's release. How does this affect the lighting artist? Does he have to keep rebuilding lights? The short answer to that question is yes. This is exactly, you've heard correctly. Um, Environment art does get changed. As long as an environment artist or a map lead or world builder knows that they have time to change stuff, they will change stuff. And yes, when they change stuff, it does mean that the lighter has to rebuild lighting and adjust things. And um, again, uh, what ends up happening is materials change, set dressing, like the placement of props changes. So that affects like shadows, right? Like if you have, say, a creepy hallway in an abandoned school, and say it's a zombie game or something like that, and you have a bunch of tables and dressers pushed over all over the place, that creates a sort of dramatic look. Lighting is gonna work with those things and create certain types of shadows, and it's going to affect the lighting composition side of things. So if a world builder decides, or an art director or whatever decides, oh man, we gotta totally change this, we want this, what happens sometimes is, a level designer may go, you know what, all of these tables and all this junk in the way is causing the player to get hitched on them. So yeah, it's causing gameplay issues. We're going to remove half of this stuff. Now, there's less shadow casting objects, and there's going to be more lighting in the hallway. So a lighter may have to adjust their lighting to get the mood back that used to be there before, when there was more objects, including the lighting, if that makes sense. Um, okay, so going back to Golden Heavens question, George and some others that we have to look up and study. Yeah, unfortunately, so I didn't want this course to focus on mental ray, because it's very easy to suddenly just focus on doing mental ray rendering, and we could easily have like a whole couple of semesters on mental ray rendering. Mental ray is a pretty deep renderer. There's a lot to mental ray. It took me years to master mental ray. I want to say it probably took me a good 2 full years to really master mental ray, and that's me, using it um, a lot, till some nights till 4 in the morning, learning all the ins and outs. Mental ray is very deep. It's a very powerful renderer. It's been used in the film industry, I want to say since maybe the mid to late 90s. So it's a very powerful renderer. Been around for a long time. Been used for a lot of movies. Um, it's very powerful, very great, but very deep as well. So we can't. I do have planned a course at some point in the future that just focuses on mental ray rendering, and that would be a course where we'd go over geometry lights in all of these different subjects that take a lot of like close study and a lot of understanding to really master. So this course is not meant to be, a mastering mental ray 101. It was meant more for fundamentals of lighting, and mental ray is a great renderer that can demonstrate all of these fundamentals of lighting, like global illumination, caustics, glossy mirror reflections, HDR rendering, final gather, things like that. So it was a great tool to use for this course, which is why I chose to use mental ray for the course. But don't worry about learning uh, mental ray, at a very low, deep level. We'll get into that in a future course. I've always wondered how lighting is handled in open world games like GTA. Is that just one single directional light that lights up the entire world? I actually haven't worked on Grand Theft Auto myself. I've never used their engine. I have not worked at Rockstar, so I really don't know their tech. Um, my guess is as good as yours as to what kind of tech they're using to get all of their exterior illumination. But if I were to take liberty and take a wild guess, I would guess that they probably have an engine that does have a similar directional light that shoots parallel light rays across the whole scene, maybe using cascaded shadow maps at a distance, similar to a lot of different engines. It's what Unreal 4 uses. I believe, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, Unreal 3 used a similar setup. I could tell you the Call of Duty engine uses pretty much the same exact type of tech for doing their exterior lighting stuff. But again, have not worked at Rockstar and have not used their engine yet in my career, so your guess is pretty much as good as mine. Next question is about lighting generally reserved for senior artists. Are there specific things we can keep in mind as environmental artists? Yeah, lighting is a lot about not just understanding the fundamentals we're going over in this course, but lighting is also about composition, about establishing mood, and about values and adding depth. Lighting really affects a lot of things. Bad lighting can hurt gameplay, it can hurt the art direction of the project, it can hurt a lot of things. But good lighting can achieve a lot of things. It can achieve good composition. It can lead the player's eye down the correct path. So it directly affects gameplay. Lighting in multiplayer games is extremely important. If if you're not really paying attention to lighting in multiplayer games, you can affect target acquisition and depth, and this affects the way that players play. Um, if lighting is not taken into account, um, or not, if it's not well respected when doing multiplayer games, especially shooter, like first-person shooter games, then you can have situations where there's no depth down like a long sight line, and this can affect your ability to target an enemy player, right? And you can have situations where really bad lighting can lead to a player being able to exploit that bad lighting to their advantage and hide unfairly from another player and have an unfair advantage during long sight lines and basically snipe a bunch of players, and kill them in an unfair way just because the lighting's really bad and it's working to the advantage of one part of the map and not both. So this is why I say that lighting is usually reserved for senior artists, artists who have a good understanding of these kinds of things, because in order to understand these things, you first of all, you don't really learn these things in school. It's extremely rare, if at all, that traditional game development schools teach these things. These things are usually learned on the job, having shipped multiple games and having worked with more senior people to you who teach you these things in the studio while you work. So it's more on the job experience. And that's why I made that comment that lighting's generally reserved for senior artists. That's not the case at all studios. There are studios that may have a lighting role for a junior artist. I've never seen it personally myself, but if someone showed me a job ad for it, I'd probably be like, oh yeah, I'm not surprised. There's got to be a studio out there who will hire a junior artist to be a dedicated lighter, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's pretty cool. But it's just been my experience that usually more senior artists are set up as lighters. Um, Level designers, to make the lighter's job easier while we work our way up. Things you wish other designers would keep in mind for you. Um, as usual, just as with lighting, environment art, world building, all that good stuff, even character artists should always work with LDs, level designers. It's a partnership. You guys are kind of married to each other, and you want to work with your level designers because they're trying to achieve a goal and you're trying to achieve a goal, and your goals should align and be the same, which is to make an awesome game that customers and players are going to play, and they're going to have a good time playing it and enjoy it. So things that designers can do to make a lighter's job easier, as long as they do their job of gray boxing levels and setting up gameplay, the lighter should constantly communicate to the LD and just be like, hey, how can I support you? How can I set up lighting to achieve what you want, right? So if an LD has a pathway and they want the player to go down that pathway, but the pathway is not that obvious, a lighter can help using lighting composition techniques. A lighter can guide the player's eyes subconsciously through the good use of depth and lighting value and even hues and colors to guide a player down the path that the level designer intended to. So both of you are kind of working together. That's one example. What's the longest you've had to wait for lighting to build in a level? In production, we have render farms or build farms that do this for us. So I personally don't sit there and wait for lighting to build, at least for doing production quality level lighting. We usually send stuff to a build farm, go home, and the next day it's already done, and we can see the results. That's usually how it works. At home, working on freelance projects or just doing my own stuff in Unreal 4 from home, I think the longest I took to build a level was maybe, I don't know, I want to say 40 minutes or something like that on insane lighting quality settings. I have a really fast computer at home, and I actually when I do Unreal 4 freelance stuff at home, I use Unreal Swarm whenever I can. I don't have like 5 computers. I have a really powerful workstation that I hand built myself, and I have a laptop. And my laptop's pretty good. It's a high-end gaming laptop, so it has like a Kaby Lake processor in it and a GTX 1070. Even though your video card's not used for rendering with light mask, but you can use Unreal Swarm to hook those guys up together and bake your lighting a little bit faster. Does lighting artists have to know a bit of particle systems? Because now we have particle lights and cascade. And I can see you're also a VFX artist. Um, Technically, no. The short answer to that question is technically no. But personally, my answer would be yes. Um, I work a lot with VFX artists at work in the studio, and I love working with those guys. Being a VFX artist, I totally understand like where they're coming from, the work that they do, and the terminology they use. So whenever they throw in new effects, it's very easy for me to interface with them. So I would say if you have the bandwidth and the motivation to do it, I would strongly suggest that you become familiar with VFX work, like particle systems and how particle systems work with lighting. Because what happens is, this is usually what happens. Uh, Say your world builders and environment artists laid out the level and arted it up. Um, you would come in and do a lighting pass. And after you do a lighting pass, the VFX artist comes in and does an effects pass. And the VFX artist is going to try to match up their particles, their values, their hues and colors and all that to your lighting. So whenever the environment team changes environment art and you have to update your lighting, the poor VFX artist is the one at the end of the rope who has to change their effects to adjust it to the lighting that changed to adjust to the environment art. That's just the way it works. There's really no way around that. But it's always good for lighting artists to understand particle systems and how they kind of interact with lighting. Um, that way, it's just an easier process. How much is traditional arts important in the games industry now? I hear character artists definitely need it. How about environment and lighting artists, though? You know what? I would say it's really important because traditional art does build a really strong foundation in an artist, and um, it'll teach you how things work and why they work the way that they work, especially if you're learning from like Renaissance artists. And that's not to say that anything outside of Renaissance art is not good. That's not what I'm saying. But at least for me, in my opinion, uh, because I like to do lighting and finishing and polishing work, and a lot of the fundamentals and things that make polishing and lighting look good are things that kind of overlap with some of the fundamentals and basic principles that were pioneered by Renaissance artists, like somebody like Leonardo da Vinci and stuff. So if you look like his work, his lighting and shading is so good because he understood the basic fundamentals of lighting in the real world, and then he applied it to his art. And lots of Renaissance artists, if not all of them, did the same thing. So we as CG artists today try to implement those types of basics and fundamentals in order to achieve high quality lighting. And it's not a thing about realism versus stylized, because if you look at, I actually just saw the movie Moana from Disney Animation Studios, and it was beautiful. It had a realistic, believable look to it, but it was very stylized. It had its own kind of look. It lived in its own world. I knew I was watching an animated feature film, but it still looked believable. Like you could swear that you could reach out and touch the blades of grass and stick your hand in the water, things like that. So the fundamentals, it's all about the fundamentals. If you've got the fundamentals down, you can do realism or stylized and do it really well. So I would say that yes, traditional arts definitely helps. Can a lighting artist move from the game industry to the film industry easily, or is there a steep learning curve for that too? I haven't gone from game industry to film industry, so I can't personally answer that question. However, I do have a deep understanding of offline rendering with renderers like Mental Ray. So I want to think that I could switch over for the film industry if I needed to, or if I wanted to for whatever reason, and do lighting. Photorealism is a lot of fun to do. I enjoy it. I have a deep understanding of photorealistic rendering. I used to do a lot of ArchViz photorealistic rendering and stuff. So to me, it's fun. It'd be a fun challenge, but um, of course, there's going to be a learning curve to that. If you've only done game lighting your entire career, then I think the learning curve is going to be a lot steeper because you're not familiar with things like caustic and mirror and glossy reflections, because the way that glossy reflections work in games is a lot different than how it works in offline rendering. Optimization is a lot different too. If you're not familiar with photorealistic rendering and you go in it the first time, your renders are probably going to be really slow and take a long time. So understanding how to optimize offline rendering tools is a whole challenge in itself. How much different would lighting change from game to animation films? Pixar, for example. Um, Again, that kind of falls around the same realm as the previous question. How much different would lighting change? It changes quite a bit. Game lighting and like feature film lighting is actually completely different in terms of the techniques and tools that are used. I'm not going to sit here and say that you're basically learning lighting from scratch again, but you're kind of learning lighting again. Um, these offline rendering tools are very powerful, but it's very easy for your renders to kind of blow out and take a really long time, like hours. I actually specialize in optimization, both for game rendering as well as photorealistic offline rendering. It's kind of a fun thing for me to do. I just like doing it, kind of tickles my technical side or whatever. Um, but it takes a very deep level understanding. So, how much different is lighting going from games to film? It's actually very different. There's a lot of things that overlap and are similar, and you can actually take with you. Like, let's say if you did game lighting for years and then you decide to go work at Pixar or DreamWorks or something, um, the workflow, the pipeline, the techniques and tools you use are going to be completely different. But if you have a good, strong base, fundamental understanding of lighting, how it works in the real world, it'll be that much easier to learn, right? So the learning curve is going to be not as steep. You'll still have a lot of learning to do, though. And yes, Moana was an amazing movie. What software? How can I make my own HDR? Ooh, that's a good question. We can sit here and talk for a bit. So this will be the last question because we're kind of over past the hour by a little bit. But that's a tough question. There's a lot of software and things that you can do to do that. There's actually programs out there. When I first started in CG, it was kind of a mystery. Very few people, only a few people, like in the film industry, knew how to make HDRs, and everyone else was kind of in the dark. No pun intended. Let me see. I'm looking for HDR Light Studio. Hang on one second. Okay, cool. I found it. I was trying to remember the name. Let me show you this real quick. This is a program called HDR Light Studio. I won't go over it or anything like that, but if you go to their website, lightmap.co.uk, or do a Google search for HDR Light Studio and it'll pop up. This is a pretty cool program. It lets you, I don't want to say it works like KeyShot, but it sort of does. But basically, what this does is it jumps into your pipeline, and from here, you can actually create HDRs in kind of this studio environment. So think of it as like a weird Photoshop slash KeyShot slash Marmoset tool bag, but for creating HDR images that you can actually render out right inside of the program. So basically, as you can see here in this little demonstration GIF or whatever, you can use these predetermined shapes of like HDR light sources, and you can place them interactively in an HDR image in real time and actually see them update and render out with a photorealistic render. In this case, it's using Maya and V-Ray. They have like a plugin, so you can actually in the program it has its own 3D renderer um, that lets you see the render update based on how you paint like hot spots and lights and stuff in the HDR. And this is great. This is actually used a lot by like the advertising industry for doing like these type of car renders or product shots and things like that. Um, which is fantastic. So you can get the highlights and things exactly where you want. This used to be a very difficult and tedious process, but this program makes it really, really easy, which is pretty cool. And you can integrate, it's got like plugins, so you can integrate it with something like Maya, and in this case, V-Ray. And I think it supports like other renderers too. So you can see it's got plugins. They have it for Modo, Cinema 4D, Maya 3ds Max, Houdini, Lightwave, lots of different programs that you can use it for. Oh, even Softimage and KeyShot. So that's pretty cool. It is a commercial program, so it's not free. They might have a free version. I don't know. It looks like they have a student license where you can save 95% or something like that. But it is a pretty cool program. Very useful if you're very, very serious about getting into like HDR. If you did freelance work for like advertising, commercials, and maybe architectural visualization or any type of product visualization, um, and this saved you time, it would be totally worth it to buy this tool. It would kind of pay for itself after a couple of jobs. So that's one way to make HDR images. Another way is to actually create them using your own camera setup. But that's too much of a deep topic, so I won't be getting into that. But if you Google HDR photography and things like that, you'll find a lot of information. Maybe I can make the subject for a course in the future. So good question. Well, I did say that would be like the last question, but okay. Maybe I'll do a couple more. Um, what's my main PC setup at home? That's a pretty simple question. I have so I always build my own computers. I never buy computers like from Best Buy and stuff. They have pretty good ones. They can be kind of pricey. I like building my own computer because I save a lot of money and I can make really powerful computers. So I use for video card, I have a GTX 1070. I didn't see the point in wasting money on a 1080 or I don't want to say wasting money, spending or investing money in a 1080 because they're just so expensive. So I'll probably wait till the price goes down. But GTX 1070s are almost as powerful. They're just below it, and they're really powerful. Like I have not run into an issue that my GTX 1070 can't handle. And I actually have a very specific 1070. I'll show you real quick for those who are really curious or are on the fence about what video card to buy. And I always give advice to people that work at my studio on what to get, just because I'm always on top of this stuff. 1 second. Here, I'm just on Newegg over here on my other screen so you guys can see this. I'm gonna do a search for GTX 1070. Da, 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 I believe it's this one. So this is actually the one that I have. This is my actual video card. I got a pretty good deal on it during like Black Friday sales, like back in November or something like that. So when you get a video card, you want to look at um, the actual speed of it because not all video cards you can get two 1070s and put them side by side, and one, even though they're both 1070s, one will actually be a lot faster than the other based on what the clock speeds are. So when you if you go on, like I use Newegg a lot, but if you go on something like Newegg, what you'll want to do is add this to compare. And let me show you. Let me go over to this other Strix. So this is the Asus line, and it's the first time I use an Asus video card, and I've been really happy so far. I usually use PNY or XFX, but Asus has been great. Um, so I'm going to look at this one. I'm going to add to compare. I'm going to hit compare. Check this out. So the one on the left is a ROG Strix GTX 1070 8G. The one on the right is the same exact card, but it's the O8G. So what's the difference between the two? They're both GTX 10 series, they're both 1070s, and they both have 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory on them. They're both 256-bit, right? But there's a big difference between these two, actually. The big difference is the clock speeds. If you look at the one on the left, which is the regular 8G, the core clock speed can reach 1,531 megahertz, right? But if you look at the other one, the O8 version, it actually reaches a higher clock speed. Same thing for the boost clock. You can see the boost clock on the one on the right is higher, over 100 megahertz higher than the one on the left. So that's really important. You want to look at that kind of stuff when you're getting a video card. I see a lot of people buy video cards and kind of go, well, they're both 1070, so I'll get the cheaper one. Not always the best idea. I like to, when I look at a card series, like say the 1070 series, I'll usually try to find a good deal on the card that has the highest clock speeds. So I actually took a long time. I actually shopped around for like a couple of weeks when I was buying this card, and I looked at like PNY, XFX, Asus, Gigabyte, a bunch of different cards, and I ended up settling on this one because this one, when I did my research, had the higher, fastest clock speeds, and that's what you want because the clock speeds determines how fast the card is. So you can have two cards that are exactly the same, but if one has higher clock speeds for the clock, the boost, or the memory clock, it's going to be faster than the other one. So that's something that I've noticed, even talking to people at work, they don't really pay attention to. So that's pretty important. The other thing that I would say is your CPU. Make sure you can get the fastest CPU you can get. Don't get Xeon CPUs. A lot of people like to get Xeons. Those are server CPUs. They're not meant for like fast things like rendering. So what you want to do is you want to get like a either Skylake or the new Kaby Lake processors from Intel. Those are really good. Get the K series. If you get the K series, they're unlocked, which means that you can overclock them. If you have a good motherboard and good cooling, you can overclock them. I have I believe I have a 6700K, which is a Skylake, but I have it overclocked. I can get that guy overclocked to about 4.7 gigahertz or 4.8, which means that my renders in Unreal or Mental Ray go a lot faster. So something to think about. Da, 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 da. Yes, game engines do use HDR images. That's the short answer to that question. Sure, I'll look at your homework really quick. I forgot this one. So we've got some global illumination going on, which is good. We do have some contact shadows, which is really good. Um, we do have some color bleeding, so we've got global illumination working. You can see the blue on the side of the cylinder here, and we've got some yellow over here. What I would say though is that the image is a little bit overexposed. The lighting is a bit strong, and having a bright yellow is only going to accentuate the brightness in the room. So you want to be careful, and that's really important when you're doing this kind of stuff. Make sure that the materials that you're using, like the color values and hues, work with the lighting really well. In this case, you've got really bright lighting, but at the same time, you've got a really bright colored wall over here on the left. The blue wall is not a problem, it's actually fine. But the yellow wall on the left is just so strong that immediately when your eyes look at this image, despite the fact that it's really bright in the center, your eye just slaps onto this yellow wall and sticks to it and doesn't want to move away. So you want to be careful about that. I would lower the value on this wall a lot more. There was actually a good render up here. You could see in this render, you can see that this wall on the right is yellow, right? So both of you have yellow walls, but this wall has much lower value. There's just more darkening in the scene, and this material is actually, it looks like it's actually physically based, so it's working really well to not reflect more energy than it receives. And what's happening here is this wall's just too bright. It's reflecting way more energy than it's receiving, which is something that never happens in the real natural world. Um, it's actually a law, one of the laws of physics, um, that a surface can't reflect more energy than it receives. So you want to make sure that the surface isn't doing that, which it clearly is in this case. So be careful about that. Take the value of the wall. It can be yellow. That's perfectly fine if you really want to have a yellow wall. Just lower the value a little bit more. Doing that, you should see a really good improvement in your scene. Other than that, it's just little things like the artifacts and the area light shadows. So increasing the sampling of the area light and increasing your anti-aliasing and the image quality settings. Will fix that, and that's pretty much it. I think that'll help out quite a bit. Cool. So that's pretty much gonna be it. I know you guys have a lot of questions, and I'd love to answer them all, but we're kind of over time. We're almost at an hour and a half. But yes, closing thoughts. Faster computers are pretty good, and always remember that video card. There's been a misinformation that's actually been around since I started computer graphics back like in 2004 or something. Um, there seems to be a lot of confusion out there where, some people seem to think that video cards are responsible for rendering. They are, but it depends on the renderer you're using. Say, for example, if you're using something like iRay, iRay uses your CPU and your GPU. But if you're using Mental Ray, um, then it doesn't. Renderers like Maxwell and Mental Ray and V-Ray use your CPU to render out. So if you go out and buy like two 1080 Ti's and you dual SLI them, you're going to be very upset when you notice that your mental ray renders aren't going any faster, and your light mass renders in Unreal are also not going faster, because light mass in Unreal works like mental ray. It's a CPU based renderer. It does not use the GPU at all. So something to think about before you spend, thousands of dollars buying two GTX 1080 Ti's and try to dual SLI them. So keep that in mind. Cool. So thanks a lot, guys, for participating. I hope you guys enjoyed this and learned something, or it was informative. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to throw them up on the Discord channel. Brandon and I are usually up on there, and we'll answer your question whenever we get a chance to. So you can hit us up on there. Thanks a lot for participating and everything, and I hope to see you guys again soon.